Good evening. Tonight we will drift into the slow rhythm of another age, where the air carried the weight of salt and smoke, and the days unfolded with the steady cadence of tide and wind. Let us step quietly into the life of Ragnar, whose days were woven from sea, soil, and shadow. The land lay beneath a low northern sun, its light diffused through veils of drifting mist. Along the coast, the sea stretched outward in hues of gray-blue, ever restless yet strangely calm in its eternal breathing. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, mingled with the faint tang of peat smoke rising from distant hearths. It was a world where sound traveled softly, carried by the wind across heathered hills and into the timbered halls of those who lived by its mercy. The earth itself seemed older here, marked by ridges of stone and dense forests of pine and oak. Streams ran clear over rounded rocks, cold and insistent, their waters feeding meadows where sheep grazed and where the coarse grasses bent under the weight of dew. Birds circled slowly above, their wings cutting through the pale light, their cries both mournful and familiar. The settlements stood low and sturdy, built from wood darkened by weather and smoke. Thatched roofs pressed heavy against the weight of sky, their edges frayed but enduring, the work of hands accustomed to resilience. Within these halls, the scent of burning pine mingled with the musk of wool, leather, and earth, creating an atmosphere both harsh and sheltering. Shadows danced upon the walls, thrown by oil lamps whose flames flickered in the draught of doors left ajar. The clothing of the people mirrored the land itself, woven from wool and linen in muted tones of earth and ash. Cloaks clasped with bronze pins hung heavy against the chill, and boots of rough leather creaked softly with each step. Their garments bore the traces of use, frayed seams, patches of darker thread, the quiet testimony of lives lived in work and endurance. And in this landscape, Ragnar moved, neither as a figure of legend nor as a distant tale, but as a man bound to the rhythms of his world. His mornings began with the muted light of dawn, when the frost still lingered upon the grass and the breath of cattle rose in pale clouds from the byre. His steps were deliberate, his frame broad but lean, marked by the labor of oars and fields. His hair, once golden, carried the shade of autumn straw, often bound at the neck with a strip of leather. His beard, coarse and flecked with the color of storm clouds, bore the marks of years salted by sea air. His hands revealed his story more clearly than any words might. Strong and scarred, the skin roughened by rope and blade, yet capable of quiet precision when carving wood or mending net. He bore himself with the ease of one accustomed to command, yet his gestures were measured, never hurried. His eyes, pale as northern skies, seemed always to rest on horizons, on things beyond the moment at hand. Life within the settlement unfolded in layers of sound and silence. The morning hours carried the scrape of wood against stone, the low murmur of women weaving at the loom, the rhythmic thud of an axe against seasoned logs. Children's laughter, high and fleeting, echoed between the houses before being carried off into the woods. Dogs lay sprawled near doorways, stirring only when strangers passed or when the air carried the scent of cooking meat. Food bore the essence of the land. Fish drawn from the rivers, bread of coarse grain, meat smoked and salted for leaner months. The taste was simple, elemental, without excess but deeply sustaining. In the great hall, long tables bore trenchers of bread, bowls of broth, and the ever-present ale, brewed thick and dark from barley. The crackle of fire and the scent of roasting fat filled the air, weaving comfort into the otherwise austere chamber. The seasons dictated everything. Winter was endured rather than lived, a time of darkness when snow pressed heavy upon the roofs and the rivers stiffened into silence. Summer, brief but fierce, was marked by the shimmer of long days when the sun lingered upon the horizon and men labored late into the evening fields. The in-between times, spring with its damp soil, autumn with its dying light, brought both toil and quiet reflection. The sea remained ever near, its presence unignorable. Boats lay drawn up upon the shingle, their hulls tar-dark and ribbed like the bones of beasts. The air within the boathouses smelled of pitch, salt, and damp wood. Ropes hung coiled, nets spread out to dry upon frames, their threads stiff with salt and seaweed. To row or to sail was not a choice, but a necessity, and every boy grew knowing the rhythm of oar and the pull of tide. Ragnar's days often began with the sea. He moved across the shingle with steps that stirred the gulls into sudden flight, the cry of their wings cutting through the morning air. His boat, though not the largest, bore the marks of care, wood polished by weather, repairs made with steady patience, the prow carved with the simplest of designs. When he pushed from shore, the oars dipped in unison with his breath, and the vessel slid forward into the wide expanse of gray. The sea was a teacher, stern and unyielding. Its surface shifted endlessly, calm one hour and threatening the next, its color changing with the clouds above. To navigate was to read the signs of birds, the tilt of wind, the shape of waves against the hull. The taste of salt lay constantly upon his lips, and the spray of cold water struck against his skin with a sharpness that awakened body and mind alike. The land, too, required his attention. Fields stretched beyond the settlement, marked by low stone walls and the labor of many hands. Grain stood golden in the brief harvest season, then cut and bound into sheaves that filled the air with the scent of dry straw. In winter, the soil lay bare and dark, a reminder of cycles both relentless and fragile. Ragnar's presence among the fields was steady, his movements slow and deliberate, his thoughts perhaps already turned toward distant horizons even as his hands worked the earth. Time was measured less by hours than by tasks completed and by the movement of the sun. Midday carried the heat of fire upon the hearth and the weight of meals shared in communal quiet. Evening fell slowly, shadows lengthening across the ground until the first stars pierced the northern sky. Night brought silence, broken only by the howl of wolves beyond the forest and the crackle of fire within the hall. As darkness deepened, the hall filled with warmth and flickering light. The walls bore shields and weapons, hung not as ornament, but as necessity. Smoke curled toward the rafters, its scent clinging to hair and cloth, marking all who dwelled within. Here stories were told, not loudly, but in steady voices, of hunts, of storms, of battles fought and endured. Yet the voices blended into the rhythm of fire and the slow breathing of those gathered close. The passage of days built itself into memory not by sudden events, but by the layering of textures and sounds. The rough grain of wood beneath the hand, the creak of leather straps, the dim glow of a fire fading to embers. These moments, small yet endless, formed the fabric of Ragnar's life as surely as the loom wove threads into cloth. And so time passed, neither hurried nor delayed, bound to the steady pulse of the land and sea. The days of Ragnar's early life held no grandeur beyond survival, no legend beyond endurance. Yet within their quiet persistence lay the foundation upon which greater tales would one day rest, as unassuming stones build the base of a hall that endures the storm. Night returned again and again, pressing gently upon the world, folding sound and movement into stillness. The settlement sank into slumber, its fires dwindling, its voices fading into the quiet breath of the earth. Only the sea remained restless, its tide advancing and retreating beneath the pale light of stars, whispering to those who would listen of journeys yet to come. The figure of Ragnar, though later carried by stories into realms of grandeur, in his own days moved with a quietness that betrayed no hunger for spectacle. He was of middling height compared to his peers, yet the breadth of his shoulders gave him a presence that lingered. His body bore the slow accumulation of toil, muscles not of display but of necessity, the enduring strength of a man accustomed to lifting timber, pulling oars, and carrying stone. The scars along his forearms spoke not of glory but of accidents, splinters, blades, the bite of rope drawn too fast across skin. When he walked, his steps seemed measured, each footfall deliberate, as though he did not wish to startle the earth beneath him. His stride was neither hurried nor languid, but steady, in harmony with the rhythm of daily tasks. The sound of his boots on packed soil was softened by the weight of woolen cloth falling around his legs, his cloak shifting faintly with the wind. At times he carried a staff, not for show, but to aid his footing on damp ground or when crossing uneven paths near the sea. His hands were his truest language. Broad, veined, and weathered, they bore within them a memory of every labor. They moved with assurance when mending the haft of an axe, their strength tempered by surprising gentleness when smoothing the fur of a hound or turning a small wooden carving in his palm. His nails, often rimmed with soil or ash, were short and square, trimmed with the edge of a knife when they grew too long. The lines upon his palms were deep and darkened, an intricate map of his life etched in callus and cut. The face he carried was carved by the seasons themselves. High cheekbones gave definition to features otherwise plain, their sharpness accentuated by the leanness of a man whose life demanded ceaseless expenditure of energy. His beard, coarse and untrimmed, gathered frost in the depths of winter and droplets of sea spray in summer. The hair above, tied loosely or bound with leather, fell in strands of sun-worn gold that darkened toward the roots. His skin was neither pale nor dark, but bore the tone of one endlessly exposed to wind, rain, and light, unevenly bronzed and roughened at the edges. But it was in his eyes that others often paused, though none lingered over long. Their color was not easily named, for they shifted with the sky, gray in the dim, blue beneath bright sun, and at times nearly colorless, like water over stone. They gave no easy warmth, yet nor did they repel. Rather, they seemed to carry a distance, a gaze that traveled further than the immediate world before him. When he sat in silence, staring into the fire, his eyes reflected not only the flame, but something that pressed beyond its reach. Though he was not given to speech without cause, silence did not render him absent. His presence was felt through stillness, the way he inclined his head when listening, the faint narrowing of his eyes when weighing a thought. His voice, when it emerged, was low and steady, not raised unless the wind demanded it. It bore the grain of wood, the rough texture of years shaped by salt and smoke. Words came few, but they were sufficient, as though each had been carved rather than spoken. In his habits, a rhythm prevailed. He rose with the pale light of dawn, his movements unhurried yet precise. His first gestures often turned toward the animals, checking their fodder, releasing them into pasture, ensuring that the smallest details were attended before any larger work. He mended his tools with patience, sharpening blades with the steady rasp of stone, the motion repetitive and almost meditative. He washed with cold water from the stream, its chill biting against his skin, leaving him wide awake and braced for the tasks ahead. His meals were sparse in the morning, a crust of bread, perhaps softened in broth, or a strip of dried fish. He drank ale not for indulgence, but for strength, the thick liquid warming his chest against the northern chill. When work called him to the shore, he prepared his nets with deliberate care, fingers untangling threads that had caught in knots, eyes scanning for tears that might lose a catch. The rhythm of preparation was as important as the act itself, for it carried within it the discipline of survival. When at sea, his movements were fluid, aligned with the boat's motion. He leaned into the pull of oars without strain, his body part of the vessel, rising and falling with the swell. He watched the birds, noting their flight, the way they veered or descended. He tasted the wind upon his lips, tilting his head slightly to gauge its direction, adjusting the sail with a practiced hand. These acts were not dramatic, but carried the weight of 1,000 repetitions, the learned language of one who lived by waters. On land, in the fields, his posture bent with the labor of the sickle, his hands steady as they bound sheaves of grain. Sweat darkened the wool at his neck, his breath drawn in long, steady pulls. Yet even in such labor, there was no waste of motion. Each gesture was exact, born of necessity, refined by practice. The work left its mark upon his body, the ache in his back as he straightened, the soreness in his thighs, the thin scratches across his arms from straw and stalks. In the hall, his presence shifted. He did not dominate the space with loudness, but with weight. When he sat at the long table, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers resting lightly upon the wood, there was a gravity that drew others' eyes. He ate with measured bites, his gaze often lowering to the plate before him rather than the faces around. Yet when a story unfolded, his eyes lifted, and his stillness became its own form of listening. Others spoke louder in his company, as if to fill the quiet he left. His habits extended beyond labor into smaller, subtler gestures. He often carried a small knife upon his belt, not for battle, but for work. In moments of pause, he would draw it and turn a piece of wood between his hands, shaving it slowly into some shape. A bird, a boat, sometimes nothing at all but a smoothing of surface. His fingers carried both strength and delicacy, as if he understood that wood, like life, could split if pressed too harshly. In his dwelling, the order of objects reflected a simple logic. Weapons leaned neatly against the wall, not scattered. Tools were kept where they might be found easily, nets folded, cloaks hung near the hearth to dry. His sleeping place was modest, furs laid upon a low frame, woolen blankets woven thick against the cold. The air carried the scent of smoke, leather, and pine resin, softened by the faint sweetness of dried herbs stored in small sacks. The animals seemed to sense him. Dogs approached without hesitation, pressing against his hand, their tails sweeping low arcs. Horses stood quietly near when he passed, their ears twitching toward him, their movements unstartled. It was as though his silence carried into them a steadiness that soothed without words. Even the smaller creatures, chickens scratching in the yard, goats tugging at tethered ropes, moved calmly in his presence, as though his shadow carried no threat. His solitude was not loneliness. At times he wandered from the hall, striding into the forest with an axe upon his shoulder. The woods closed around him in a green hush, broken only by the rustle of undergrowth and the occasional call of a bird. He felled trees with rhythmic strokes, the sound echoing into the distance, the scent of sap sharp in the air. When the work was done, he sat upon the stump, breathing slowly, his hand resting against the rough bark, his gaze lifted toward the canopy where light filtered down in shifting patterns. At other times, he stood upon the headlands, the sea stretched before him in endless gray. The wind pressed against his cloak, the salt clinging to his lips. He remained there long after others would have turned back, his eyes fixed upon the horizon. In these moments, he seemed both part of the land and apart from it, a man rooted in soil, yet always listening for something carried across water. Rituals, too, shaped his life, though they were less adorned than stories later told. He washed his hands before meals, not out of vanity, but from a respect for the food that sustained. He touched the doorframe lightly upon entering his hall, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than superstition. At night, before laying himself to rest, he stirred the fire to ensure its embers would endure until morning, the faint glow a promise against the weight of cold and dark. His relationship with time was unlike that of later ages. He did not mark hours by devices, but by the sun's arc, the shadow's length, the calls of birds. He did not rush tasks, for rushing served nothing in a world bound to the pace of seasons. Instead, his movements reflected acceptance, of delay, of repetition, of the slow unfolding of days into years. When winter deepened and darkness grew long, he adjusted to the slower rhythm. He spent more time indoors, his knife and wood in hand, the fire his companion. The sound of crackling flame mingled with the soft rasp of blade against timber. Snow pressed against the roof above, muffling the world into silence. His breath rose in slow clouds, his body wrapped in wool, his thoughts unspoken but steady. To those around him, he was not yet a figure of saga, but simply a man, dependable, strong, marked by silence, bound by the same cycles as all. And yet there lingered something in the way he observed, the way he carried himself, that suggested he walked with awareness of more than the present. A man of the earth and sea, yet listening always for echoes beyond them. The days layered upon themselves, each alike and yet distinct, like waves breaking endlessly upon the shore. In the quiet persistence of habit, in the rhythm of hand, step, and gaze, Ragnar's life unfolded, not as legend, not as myth, but as the simple, steady presence of a man bound to his world, shaping it even as it shaped him. And so the nights closed again, pressing down with their gentle weight, the settlement hushed into sleep. Fire dwindled, embers glowed faintly, and beyond the walls the sea whispered its unending lull. The land of Ragnar's time was not a silent one, though its voice was slow, spoken in seasons, storms, and the movements of people who pressed against one another in survival. It was an age neither fully savage nor truly settled, a borderland of history where memory clung to the soil and rumor traveled faster than law. The climate shaped everything. Winters came long and heavy, their darkness stretching across the horizon until it seemed the sun itself might fail. Snow pressed deep into valleys, blocking paths, binding rivers in ice. The air grew sharp enough to bite at lungs, each breath a reminder of the fragility of warmth. Men and women moved slower in those months, their cloaks thick, their voices hushed, their hands turned more often to the preservation of what little remained from the harvest. The smoke of hearths hung low against the sky, unmoving in the heavy air, carrying with it the scent of burning peat and pine. Spring loosened the earth with water and mud. Floods came from the melting snow, rivers swollen and restless, sweeping away branches, stones, sometimes even huts built too near their banks. Yet with the mud came life, shoots of green pushing through the soil, lambs bleating in the meadows, birds returning in restless flight. The people bent to the soil with renewed strength, sowing barley, rye, and oats, their hands dark with the wet earth. Summer was brief but radiant. The days lengthened until night seemed almost forgotten, the sun hovering just above the horizon long after the work was done. The fields shimmered with grain, the sea grew calmer, and voyages began, boats cutting through water like needles pulling thread. Smoke no longer meant the warmth of hearths, but the fires of outdoor feasts, the scent of roasting meat drifting across the settlement. It was a season of labor and movement, of journeys begun and harvests gathered. Autumn brought the steady drum of rain, the soil growing heavy underfoot, the air thick with damp. Leaves darkened and fell, forming carpets of red and gold beneath the trees. The people prepared for the coming darkness, storing grain in clay-lined pits, salting fish, drying meat, repairing thatch and timber against the storms that would soon return. It was a time of anticipation, when the weight of survival pressed close, and each task carried the weight of necessity. The world beyond Ragnar's settlement was a shifting web of kinship and conflict. Small communities lay scattered across the coastlines and river valleys, each bound by ties of blood, loyalty, and necessity. Alliances formed through marriages, through oaths sworn in smoky halls, through the sharing of mead and gifts. Yet such bonds were fragile. A broken promise, a dispute over land, a single act of theft could unravel them, leaving blood spilled upon the soil. The sound of iron on anvil was never far. Blacksmiths worked endlessly, forging blades, nails, rivets, the tools of both farming and war. The clang of hammer against metal carried across the settlement, ringing like a reminder of both creation and destruction. Weapons were not rare ornaments, but necessities, hung upon walls, strapped to belts, leaned against doorframes. Even in times of peace, the memory of violence lingered, and preparation for its return was constant. Beyond the settlements lay the forests, vast and unyielding. They were both refuge and threat, filled with game, yet also with wolves and bears. The air beneath the canopy was damp and thick, the ground uneven with roots and moss. To travel through them was to move with caution, for the paths shifted, streams cut new courses, and the silence carried with it both safety and unease. The seas connected these scattered worlds. Longships, their hulls narrow and swift, stitched the coasts together like threads upon cloth. They carried not only warriors, but traders, merchants, travelers seeking opportunity. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the forests, iron from the earth, all passed through these waters, exchanged for silver, wine, and cloth from distant lands. Ports were not cities as they would later become, but gatherings of huts, stalls, and fire pits where goods changed hands and voices mingled in a dozen tongues. Conflict was as constant as trade. Raids struck from one settlement to another, often timed with the hunger of spring or the bounty of summer. They were not always grand or legendary, but sudden and harsh. Boats drawn quickly upon the shore, doors broken, fires lit, animals driven off. The smoke of such raids could be seen for miles, rising above the trees, a grim reminder that no hall was entirely safe. Yet raids also built reputations, forged names that traveled further than the men themselves. Kingship, if such a word could be used, was fragile and fluid. Power lay not in crowns, but in the gathering of men willing to follow. A man with silver, land, or ships might call himself king, but his strength lasted only as long as others stood beside him. Loyalty was earned through generosity, through gifts of weapons and food, through the promise of victory. A chieftain who withheld or failed to provide found himself quickly abandoned, his hall left silent, his fire dying cold. In Ragnar's time, the Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians were not yet bound as nations, but as loose gatherings of clans and families, each with their own lands, their own rivalries. Across the sea lay the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, themselves fractured, their borders shifting under pressure from neighbors and from their own disputes. The Franks further south were strong and organized, their wealth greater, their armies disciplined. Yet even there, divisions ran deep, and whispers of opportunity carried northward across the waters. The church had begun to stretch its influence into these lands, though its roots were shallow. Monasteries stood upon islands and riverbanks, their stone walls rising against the sky, their bells tolling in measured hours. To those within, the world was ordered by prayer and scripture. To those outside, these places appeared as both strange and vulnerable, holding wealth in books, vessels, and cattle. The clash between these two worlds was not yet full, but the tension simmered, a current that would one day break into storm. For now, the settlements lived in cycles of endurance. The halls echoed with songs of ancestors, with stories of hunts, voyages, and storms survived. These were not yet the sagas written in later centuries, but the spoken threads of memory, carried from one generation to the next beside the fire. Each word was shaped by the speaker, changed with the telling, yet anchored in the shared knowledge of hardship. The soundscape of the age was filled with simplicity and weight. The creak of leather harnesses, the lowing of cattle, the ring of axe against wood, the rush of streams swollen with spring thaw. The air carried the sharp tang of smoke, the sweetness of mead, the musk of wet wool. The sights were of earth and water. Smoke rising into low skies, sails cutting across the horizon, the gleam of metal in firelight. In this world, Ragnar's life unfolded not in isolation, but within the weave of history itself. He was part of a generation pressed between need and ambition, between survival and possibility. The soil beneath his hands, the oar within his grip, the axe across his shoulder, all bound him to a time of restless change. The hall at night reflected this mixture of endurance and tension. Shields hung along the walls, their wood darkened by smoke, their edges dented by use. Spears stood in clusters near the benches, their shafts polished by countless grips. Men sat close together, their voices low, the mead warming their bellies, their eyes reflecting the glow of fire. The talk was often of weather, of herds, of fields, but beneath these words ran the constant question of power: who would lead, where they might go, what strength could be gathered. The younger men listened with sharp attention, their minds restless, their hands fidgeting upon the hilts of knives. The older ones spoke less, but their presence bore weight. Women moved quietly between them, refilling cups, placing food, their presence steady as the fire itself. Children, curled in furs along the wall, listened without seeming to, their small eyes absorbing every tone, every gesture, carrying them forward into memory. This was the fabric of Ragnar's time, woven from seasons, shaped by hunger and ambition, bound by both the nearness of death and the persistence of life. A world neither simple nor grand, but filled with the slow, steady weight of endurance. And beyond all, the sea waited, ever restless, ever calling, its waves whispering of lands beyond the horizon, of wealth and hardship, of futures yet unmade. The first stirrings of Ragnar's life upon the sea were not the grand raids that later tales would exalt, but quieter, smaller journeys, where the weight of preparation mattered as much as the motion of water itself. The sea, always present, had whispered to him since childhood. Its rhythm was familiar, yet stepping into it with purpose carried a different weight, something solemn, as though each voyage bound man to tide and wind in a covenant that could never be broken. Preparation was slow, deliberate, and communal. The boat stood upon the shingle, drawn high enough to escape the bite of tide, its hull gleaming with fresh tar, black and shining in the pale sun. Men moved about it with tools in hand, their bodies bent, their voices low. The scent of pine resin, heated and sticky, mingled with the salt air. Ropes were coiled and tested, their fibers rough beneath fingers, each knot tied with practiced care. Sails were spread and checked, linen stiff yet pliant, edges patched from earlier journeys. The work was not rushed. Each detail mattered, for upon such details rested lives. Ragnar's hands worked among the others, unhurried, precise. He lifted planks, hammered pegs, tested the tension of oarlocks. Sweat darkened the wool at his shoulders despite the coolness of morning, his breath steady, his gaze intent. He said little, for little needed to be spoken. The rhythm of preparation was its own language, each man understanding his part, each task unfolding into the larger whole. The air carried anticipation, though no one named it aloud. Journeys always bore uncertainty, the promise of fish, of trade, perhaps of something more. Yet alongside promise lay the memory of storms, of boats lost, of men who never returned. This mixture gave the air its heaviness, though the sea itself lay calm, its surface gleaming like a mirror broken only by the slow passage of gulls. When the time came, the boat slid down the shingle with a sound like thunder, wood against stone. The water received it with a hiss and a surge, foam curling white against its sides. The men moved quickly then, shoulders pressing, oars lowering, voices raised in brief commands. The hull steadied, rocked, then settled into the swell. Ragnar stepped aboard with the others, the planks shifting under his weight, the scent of tar and salt rising together. The motion of rowing was a rhythm older than memory. Oars dipped and rose in unison. Wood creaking, water splashing against sides. The muscles of men's arms and backs strained, their breath drawn in long pulls, yet the rhythm steadied quickly, each stroke part of the greater motion. The boat moved forward with a grace that belied its weight, slicing through the water, leaving a narrow trail of foam behind. Ragnar pulled with the rest, his body leaning into the oar, his hands gripping the worn wood. The effort was familiar, his muscles accustomed to its demand, his breath steady. Yet beneath the labor lay something deeper, a sense of movement not merely across water, but towards something larger, though undefined. He did not name it, nor would he have tried. It was simply there, carried upon the wind, whispered by the tide. The sea's face changed even within hours. At times it lay calm, a wide expanse of gray-blue, reflecting the slow drift of clouds above. At other moments, waves rose suddenly, slapping against the hull, spraying cold salt upon faces and cloaks. The men adjusted without thought, their bodies leaning, their oars shifting, their eyes scanning the horizon. The boat became not separate from them but part of them, alive in its own way, its creaks and groans part of the chorus of movement. The coastline unfurled slowly. Forests pressed against the shore, their dark shapes mirrored in the water. Streams cut down from the hills, carrying silt that clouded the sea near their mouths. Occasionally, smoke rose from distant huts, thin and fragile against the sky. These sights were both familiar and strange, the nearness of land, yet the awareness that distance could grow swiftly with each pull of the oars. At night, the boat was drawn ashore, fires lit upon the beach, their flames flickering in the wind. Fish caught from the sea were roasted upon spits, their flesh crackling, the air thick with their scent. Men sat in circles, cloaks drawn tight, their faces shadowed by flame. Voices murmured, sometimes rising in laughter, sometimes sinking into silence. Ragnar sat among them, his eyes fixed upon the fire, the crackle of wood and the hiss of sea mingling into a rhythm both soothing and endless. The stars stretched above in their cold brilliance. The men lay upon furs and cloaks, their bodies curled against the chill, their breaths rising in pale clouds. Ragnar lay still, eyes open, gazing at constellations he had learned to read. Hunters, serpents, the wheeling form of the bear. These lights were both guide and mystery, fixed yet unfathomable, marking paths across waters that men dared to follow though they never fully understood them. The early voyages were simple, seeking fish, trading goods, testing skill against distance. Yet even in these beginnings lay the seeds of something greater. Each journey deepened the knowledge of tide and wind, of how the sea shifted with moon and storm, of how men's endurance bent but did not break. Ragnar learned not only with his hands, but with his eyes, how to read the faintest line of darker water that marked a current, how to sense the coming of rain in the heaviness of air, how to hear the change in waves that signaled land unseen. There were moments of unease, too. Sudden fogs rolled in, blanketing sea and sky alike, leaving the boat adrift in whiteness. The men rowed on, their breath harsh, the sound of oars echoing strangely. In such moments, silence grew heavy, each man aware of the fragility of wood upon endless water. Yet the fog always lifted, slowly, reluctantly, revealing again the horizon, the faint outline of land, the path forward. Encounters with others were rare, yet not absent. Boats passed upon the water, their crews raising hands in greeting or suspicion. Words were shouted across waves, their meaning sometimes clear, sometimes lost in the wind. At times, the meeting led to trade, furs for fish, iron for cloth, gifts exchanged with cautious eyes. At other times, the air bristled with tension, hands tightening on oars, on knives, on axes resting near. But more often than not, distance was kept, each boat continuing its path, the sea too wide to force conflict without cause. The rhythm of such journeys etched itself into Ragnar's life. Days began with the pale light of dawn upon the water, the chill of spray striking against his face. Midday brought the glare of sun upon waves, the taste of salt upon lips, the ache of muscles drawn long in rowing. Evening descended with firelight upon the shore, the slow settling of bodies into rest. Night wrapped the sea in silence, the stars pressing close, the horizon a dark line against their brilliance. Through it all, Ragnar remained steady, his silence deepening, his gaze always outward. He learned the feel of the boat beneath him, the sound of its timbers in calm and storm alike. He learned the faces of his companions, the way each man breathed, rowed, lifted his head toward the horizon. He learned, too, of himself, the endurance of his body, the patience of his spirit, the stirrings within him when the sea stretched wide and endless, carrying promise yet unnamed. The first voyages ended where they began, upon the shingle of home, the boat drawn once more from the tide, the men stepping ashore with weary bodies and salt-stiffened cloaks. The settlement greeted them with smoke rising from hearths, with the lowing of cattle, with the familiar scent of wood and earth. The sea released them, yet its pull lingered, whispering still in the crash of waves upon stone. Ragnar returned to his hall, to the fire, to the slow rhythm of fields and flocks. Yet something within him had shifted, though it bore no name. He had moved with the sea, tasted its uncertainty, felt the horizon draw nearer and yet further still. His life was no longer only of land and soil, but of water and sky, of journeys begun though not yet finished. The sea waited, always, patient and vast, its tide advancing and retreating with the moon. And Ragnar, though returned to shore, carried its rhythm within him, his silence deepened by its voice, his gaze fixed ever further toward horizons unseen. The first taste of danger upon the sea did not arrive with the roar of armies or the blaze of great fires, but in the smaller, sharper moments when the line between safety and ruin thinned to a breath. For Ragnar and those beside him, the sea was always a teacher, stern, unyielding, and never free of risk. Yet it was upon the shore, where men's desires and fears collided, that he first felt the nearness of violence, not as a tale spoken by the fire, but as something that pressed upon the body and soul alike. It began with a journey outward, much like the others before it. The boat slipped into the water at dawn, its hull gleaming dark with tar, its sail catching the early wind. The men rowed in silence, their strokes long and even, the mist still lying low upon the water. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, the cries of gulls carrying above them. There was no foretelling that the day would bear weight beyond its own passage. The coastline grew distant, fading into haze. Hours passed in rhythm, the creak of oars, the dip and rise of water, the steady breath of men bent to their labor. By midday, the sea had calmed, its surface like hammered bronze beneath the pale sun. It was then that another sail appeared upon the horizon, faint at first, a pale shape against the line of sky and water. The men lifted their eyes, oars pausing for a heartbeat before resuming. The boat drew nearer slowly, its form resolving into wood and linen, its movement steady, deliberate. The other crew could be seen now. Men seated, their oars cutting water in practiced rhythm, their figures shadowed by the sail above them. No words passed between the boats at first, only the unspoken knowledge that paths had crossed, and that the sea, vast as it was, could suddenly feel narrow. When the distance closed further, voices rose, shouts carried across water, sharp and indistinct. Hands lifted in gestures, some in greeting, others less certain. The air grew taut, as though stretched between the two boats. Ragnar's grip upon his, or tightened, the wood rough beneath his calloused palms. His gaze fixed upon the approaching figures, the gleam of metal at their belts, the set of their shoulders. The boats drifted closer, rocking in the same swell, until the faces of the strangers could be seen. Their eyes were watchful, their mouths set in thin lines. A moment passed, heavy and uncertain, when time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a suddenness that felt like a storm breaking, hands reached for weapons. Blades flashed in the sun, axes lifted, voices rose in harsh cries. The air filled with sound, the clash of wood against wood as boats knocked together, the ring of iron, the shouts of men straining against fear and fury. Ragnar's body moved before thought, his hand finding the haft of his axe, the weight of it familiar, yet altered by the presence of true threat. He swung not with the flourish of a saga hero, but with the blunt necessity of survival, his breath sharp in his chest, his muscles straining. The clash was close, almost suffocating. The smell of sweat and salt mingled with the tang of iron, the spray of water stinging eyes and skin. Oars snapped, splinters flying, feet slipped upon wet planks. Voices blurred into a single roar, broken only by the thud of blows and the groan of wood under strain. Ragnar felt his body strike and be struck, the shock of impact running through bone and sinew, each movement driven not by thought, but by instinct. It was not a long struggle, though it felt endless. One boat pulled back, its crew shouting, pushing oars against the water, breaking the closeness. The distance widened suddenly, the noise fading with it, until only the sea's own voice remained, the slap of waves, the cry of gulls circling above. The other boat turned away, its sail catching the wind, its figures receding into the horizon. Silence fell heavy. The men in Ragnar's boat breathed hard, their chests heaving, their faces pale with the aftershock of what had passed. Blood marked some of them, streaks upon skin, smears upon cloth. The boat itself bore scars, planks splintered, ropes frayed, a section of railing broken. Yet it still floated, and they still lived. That knowledge alone felt like a gift wrested from the sea. Ragnar sat among them, his axe resting heavy in his hand, his breath slow to steady. His gaze fixed upon the water, upon the ripples spreading outward, upon the horizon now empty. The weight within him was not triumph, but something quieter, heavier, the knowledge that danger had stepped close, that life balanced upon a knife's edge as surely as upon a plank above the sea. When they reached shore that night, the boat drawn once more upon the shingle, the settlement gathered to meet them. The sight of blood upon their garments, of broken wood upon the hull, drew murmurs, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. The story passed quickly, though in hushed tones, the details shifting even as they were told. Some spoke of victory, others of narrow escape, yet for Ragnar, no single word could capture what had settled in his chest. That night in the hall, firelight flickered upon weary faces. Meat and bread were set before them, ale poured thick and dark, yet the food carried little taste. The voices of others rose, telling and retelling, shaping the event into something already larger than itself. Ragnar sat in silence, his eyes upon the flame, the sound of the sea still echoing in his ears, the weight of axe and or still heavy in his arms. Sleep came late. When it did, it brought not rest but the memory of sound, the crash of wood, the shout of voices, the hiss of water against hull. He woke before dawn, his body restless, his mind caught between gratitude for survival and the sharp awareness of how near they had come to its absence. The days that followed carried a subtle change. The men moved with the same rhythm, the same tasks, the same preparations, yet beneath their gestures lay a new tension. They knew now what it meant to meet another boat not as friend or traitor, but as rival, as threat. Each rope tied, each blade sharpened, each sail patched bore a sharper weight, as though every detail might again mean the difference between return and loss. Ragnar himself grew quieter still. His gaze lingered longer upon the horizon, his movements more deliberate. He carried his axe not only as tool but as companion, his hand resting upon it when thought pressed heavy. The sea had shown him its edge, and though he had not fallen, the memory of its nearness did not fade. Another journey came, as all journeys must. The boat was prepared, the men boarded, the oars dipped once more into the water. The sea stretched before them, calm and gleaming, its surface betraying nothing of what might come. Yet within each man lay the memory of that earlier clash, a silence carried in their eyes, a readiness in their hands. The horizon remained vast, the sky wide, the air filled with salt and gulls. But now the sea spoke not only of distance and promise, but of danger, of the suddenness with which life could shift, of the fine line upon which all men walked when they set themselves upon its surface. Ragnar carried this knowledge with him, woven into the rhythm of his breath, the strength of his arms, the silence of his gaze. The world had revealed itself not only as soil and hearth, but as tide and clash, as horizon both promising and perilous. And though he did not speak of it, though he gave no words to the weight within him, it shaped him all the same, silent, enduring, steady as the sea itself. The settlement lay quiet in the pale light of morning, yet beneath the stillness something had shifted. The air seemed denser, more watchful, as though the earth itself remembered the clash that had brushed so close. Smoke drifted from low roofs, the smell of damp wood mingling with the sharper scent of pine. Cattle stirred within their pens, their lowing carried on the wind, while the dogs that guarded the edges of the hall barked more often, restless, as though sensing a presence unseen. Within this quiet, life continued, yet with an altered rhythm. Men moved about their tasks with greater care, sharpening blades more often, checking the bindings of shields, oiling the heads of axes until they gleamed in firelight. Oars were inspected again and again, their wood smoothed and reinforced, as though each stroke might carry the memory of resistance. The boats, once simple tools of journey, were now treated as companions of uncertain loyalty, worthy of tending, for they alone bore men between the promise of sea and the safety of shore. Ragnar himself rose each morning with the same calmness as before, yet within him the sense of watchfulness deepened. His silence was not of emptiness but of weight, his eyes drawn always outward, toward horizon, toward tide, toward the lines of smoke rising from his own hull. He spent long hours near the boats, his hands working with tar and rope, his breath slow, his thoughts steady yet unspoken. He listened to the sea, not in words but in rhythm, the push and pull of tide, the hiss of waves against shingle, the cries of birds that wheeled above. Each sound seemed sharper now, edged with meaning, though what it foretold remained hidden. The hall at night carried its own atmosphere. Fires burned low, their smoke curling against the rafters. Shadows gathered in corners, long and slow-moving, as men and women sat in silence more often than in laughter. Words were spoken, but they carried less mirth. Stories were told, but their endings faltered, as though no one wished to tempt the fates with boldness. Even the children, usually loud with play, seemed to sense the shift, their voices quieter, their games gentler. The women of the settlement, too, felt the weight of change. Their hands wove cloth with greater speed, their eyes watching the men as they prepared, knowing well what preparation meant. Herbs were gathered and stored, their scents strong within baskets hung from beams. Sage, yarrow, thyme, all pressed and dried against the day when wounds might need tending. Bread was baked in greater quantity, its crusts dark and fragrant, stored for journeys that stretched beyond the comfort of home. The weather itself seemed altered, though perhaps it was only perception. Winds carried a sharper edge, even when mild, and clouds lingered longer upon the horizon, their shapes heavy, their colors muted. Nights grew colder, fires burned brighter, cloaks were drawn tighter. The sound of the sea, always present, seemed louder now, as though each wave bore warning as much as rhythm. Ragnar often walked the shoreline alone. His steps pressed into the damp sand, leaving tracks soon washed away by tide. He studied the horizon with steady gaze, his breath slow, his body still. He did not speak of what he sought, for words could not name it. It was not a sight, nor a sound, but a presence, something vast and stirring, something that pressed upon the world like a hand upon the shoulder. He felt it in the weight of the wind, in the scent of salt, in the stillness that followed the cries of gulls. At times he returned to the hall with driftwood gathered from the shore, its surface smoothed by water, its shapes twisted by tide. He carried these pieces as though they held meaning, setting them by the fire, turning them in his hands, studying their forms. Others watched, but did not question, for in his silence they sensed depth, and no one wished to disturb it. The settlement prepared not through proclamation, but through rhythm. Blades were honed, sails repaired, food stored, ropes twisted anew. Each task bore the weight of repetition, yet none complained, for all understood. The memory of danger lingered not as fear, but as knowledge, shaping every gesture, every breath. Ragnar's children, still young, their hair pale, their faces bright, watched their father with wide eyes. They sensed his quiet, though they did not name it. At times he lifted them onto his shoulders, carrying them across the fields, their laughter carried on the wind. At other times he sat in silence as they played near the hearth, his gaze fixed upon the fire, his hand resting absently upon the haft of his axe. The balance of joy and weight was delicate, yet it endured, as the tide endures, advancing and retreating without end. The fields lay harvested, their stubble sharp beneath the pale sky. The granaries stood full, their wooden doors bound with rope, the scent of grain rich within. The herds grew thick with winter coat, their breath misting in the cold. Life carried on, steady and familiar, yet beneath it all ran the undercurrent of readiness, of waiting. At night, Ragnar lay upon furs, his body still, his breath slow. Yet his mind carried the sea's rhythm, the memory of clash, the nearness of danger. Dreams came rarely, and when they did, they bore no clear images, only sounds, the crash of waves, the ring of iron, the cry of gulls wheeling above endless water. He woke before dawn often, rising to walk the shoreline once more, his cloak drawn close, his footsteps silent. The days passed, each alike yet altered. The settlement grew quieter, more watchful, its people bound together not by fear, but by shared awareness. They felt themselves upon the edge of something larger, though it remained unseen. The sea called with greater insistence, its voice steady, patient, unrelenting. And Ragnar, though he did not speak of it, carried within him the knowledge that life had turned a corner. The world was no longer only hearth and field, nor even sea and shore, but something greater, something vast and stirring, something that pressed upon him with the weight of destiny itself. Yet he did not seek to name it. He moved through his days with silence and steadiness, his hands tending to axe and oar, to rope and sail, to fire and hearth. He listened to the wind, to the sea, to the silence between. And in that listening lay his strength, his patience, his readiness for whatever path would next unfold. The longhouse glowed with the dim firelight of many torches, their flames bending and swaying in the draught that crept along the rafters. The great beams overhead held the smoke in a thin haze, through which the glow of embers flickered like stars behind clouds. Men gathered here more often now, not only for feasting, but for talk, for planning, for the slow shaping of thoughts that might one day turn into journeys far greater than the small ventures of earlier days. The benches were worn smooth by years of use, the furs upon them soft, and smelling faintly of smoke and hide. The air carried scents both sharp and heavy: roasted meat, spilled ale, the tang of iron newly polished, and the earthy odor of damp wool. The sounds of voices filled the hall, yet they were lower than the merriment of older nights. These were not the loud boasts of feasts, but the steady murmur of men weighing possibilities, their words measured, their pauses long. Maps, such as they were, lay stretched across a plank of oak near the central fire. They were not maps in the sense of later times, drawn with fine ink and precise borders, but rough sketches made with charcoal on hide. Marks of rivers, outlines of coasts, names of settlements half remembered, scratched lines of routes carried in memory rather than ink. Fingers pointed to them, tracing paths across imagined distances, stopping at uncertain places where knowledge faltered. Ragnar sat among them, his silence not absence but presence. His gaze followed the lines drawn by others, his hands resting still upon his knees. At times he leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharpness of his features, the wear of labor and salt etched into the skin. He spoke seldom, yet when he did, the men listened, for his words bore weight not through flourish, but through their quiet precision. The talk was not of great conquest yet, but of nearer ventures, settlements along rivers. Coastal villages spoken of by traders, distant isles where smoke rose from hearths unseen by most. The men spoke of what might be found there: grain, cattle, cloth, iron, perhaps silver. Yet alongside such thoughts came caution, for they knew too well the sharpness of resistance, the cost of a poorly chosen path. Outside the hall, the wind pressed against the timbers, its voice low, insistent. Snow had not yet come, but the air carried the weight of winter, its chill creeping through gaps in the walls. The sea lay restless under the moon, its waves breaking against stone with steady rhythm, as though echoing the measured talk within the hall. Days were spent in preparation. The boats were hauled higher upon the shore, their hulls scraped and sealed with tar, their planks reinforced where age had weakened them. Sails were patched with new cloth, their edges stitched tight with cords twisted from hemp and hair. Oars were carved anew, their wood pale and fresh, their surfaces smoothed by careful hands. Each detail mattered, for each bore the weight of distance and danger. Blades were sharpened until they sang beneath the whetstone. Shields were bound with iron rims, their wood polished, their surfaces painted with simple patterns, circles, lines, marks of meaning known to each man who bore them. Axes and spears were checked again and again, their shafts fitted, their heads tightened. Nothing was left to chance, for chance upon the sea could not be trusted. Ragnar moved among these tasks with the same quiet steadiness as before. His hands carried tar, rope, wood, his body bent to labor as any other. Yet the men felt his presence as anchor, his silence binding them more surely than words. He was not yet their leader in name, but already their eyes turned to him in moments of uncertainty, seeking in his stillness a reflection of their own readiness. Evenings brought gatherings once more, smaller circles by firelight. Ale was drunk, bread eaten, meat shared. Voices rose in low songs, not of triumph, but of rhythm, their tones slow and deep, echoing the endless pull of or against water. The songs steadied the mind, carried away the sharpness of fear, and bound men together in the memory of those who had gone before. The women of the settlement felt the change most keenly, though they spoke of it seldom. Their hands worked with urgency, weaving cloth for sails and tunics, stitching leather for boots and belts, preparing herbs and salves for wounds not yet made. Their eyes lingered longer upon their husbands, sons, brothers, as though memorizing the shape of their faces, the sound of their laughter, the weight of their presence. The hearth grew both warmer and lonelier in the same moment. The children, sensing what lay unspoken, grew watchful. They played less wildly, their games quieter, their eyes following the men with uncomprehending awe. At night, they listened to the murmur of voices beyond their sleep, the rhythm of plans and the creak of benches, and though they could not name it, they felt the shape of change pressing upon the hall. The natural world, too, seemed to prepare. The sky grew heavier with clouds, the days shorter, the nights longer. The fields lay bare, the trees stripped of leaves, their branches black against the pale horizon. The sea grew colder, its spray biting against skin, its waves darker, more insistent. The gulls cried with sharper voices, their wings stark white against the gray. Ragnar walked often alone to the shore, his steps steady, his gaze fixed upon the restless line of water. He stood with the wind pressing his cloak, his hair pulled back by the salt air, his eyes unblinking. He did not speak of what stirred within him, for words were too small. Yet his silence carried knowledge, that the horizon called not as it once had, with curiosity, but now with necessity. Something waited beyond it, though unseen, and the time to meet it drew near. Nights in the hall deepened with this sense of waiting. Men lingered longer by the fire, sharpening blades not from need, but from restlessness. The sound of whetstone against steel became its own rhythm, steady, insistent. Shadows lengthened upon the walls. The fire burning lower, the torches sputtering in the draught. Sleep came late to many, their bodies lying still while their minds wandered along imagined coasts, across waters wide and uncertain. The settlement itself grew hushed. The usual bustle of trade, of talk, of laughter seemed subdued, as though all ears strained toward some distant sound not yet heard. Even the dogs barked less, lying watchful by the hearths, their eyes reflecting the flames. The stillness was not emptiness, but fullness, an air heavy with what was yet to come. Through it all, Ragnar remained steady. His silence grew deeper, his gaze farther. He carried the weight of his own readiness not as burden but as anchor, his presence binding the threads of preparation into a whole. Though he did not name himself as leader, nor did others name him thus, he was already the center around which their silence turned. And so the days passed, each one carrying them nearer to departure. The boats waited upon the shore, their hulls gleaming dark with tar, their sails folded but ready, their oars lined in even rows. The weapons hung in order, their edges sharp, their wood polished. The food lay stored, the cloaks mended, the ropes coiled. The horizon waited, vast and silent. The sea pressed against the shore, patient, eternal, its rhythm steady as breath. And within the hall, within the hearts of men and women alike, the sense of waiting grew heavier, deeper, until it became not only anticipation, but inevitability. Ragnar felt it most of all. He rose each morning with the tide, walked each evening beneath the stars, his silence unbroken, his readiness complete. The time would come soon. The horizon would open. The boats would slip into the water once more. And what awaited beyond would shape not only days, but lifetimes. The keel of the first boat struck gently against the shallows, the sound dull and final after so many days of water alone. The waves hissed up the sand, foaming white around the hull, then withdrew, leaving the boat rocking lightly in their retreat. Oars lifted, dripping, then lay still across the gunwales. Silence fell, deeper even than on the open sea. For a moment the men did not move. They sat upon their benches, their eyes fixed on the shore that stretched before them. Sand lay pale and damp, scattered with stones polished smooth by tide. Beyond it rose a line of grass, thick and coarse, its blades stirring faintly in the morning wind. Behind the grass loomed trees, dark and tall, their trunks rising close together, their crowns knitting into a wall of green shadow. The air was heavy with scents long absent, the sharpness of pine, the damp richness of earth, the faint sweetness of moss. After weeks of salt and water, the smell struck them with force, filling lungs, pressing deep into thought. Some of the men drew in long breaths, closing their eyes as if to drink it fully. Others clenched fists upon their knees, holding themselves still, unwilling to show the trembling that stirred within them. Ragnar stood first. His boots stepped from wood to sand, sinking slightly into the damp ground. He paused there, his eyes upon the trees, his shoulders straight, his presence calm. The sea whispered at his back, but he did not turn. The land stretched before him, silent, waiting. One by one, the others followed. Their boots pressed into sand, their cloaks stirred by wind, their eyes shifting from forest to shore to sky. Some bent low, touching the earth with calloused hands, rubbing grains of sand between fingers as though to prove it real. Others lifted stones, weighing them, turning them, their surfaces rough and solid after weeks of nothing but water's fluid shape. The dogs leapt ashore too, their paws scattering sand, their noses pressed to earth, their tails high. They ran in short bursts, then stopped, sniffing, their ears pricked, their bodies tense with the strangeness of scent. Their presence stirred something steady in the men, a reminder of hearths and fires left behind. The boats were pulled higher, their hulls scraping against shingle. Ropes were secured to stones, anchors set deep, sails folded. The men moved slowly, their bodies weary, yet their hands precise, careful not to leave their vessels vulnerable. For though land promised rest, it also carried the unknown, and the boats remained their only tie to safety. When the work was done, they gathered upon the sand. Their breaths rose in faint clouds, their faces pale with weariness, their eyes dark with wonder. None spoke loudly. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. Instead, They looked outward, to the trees, to the grass, to the hills that rose faintly beyond. The silence of the land pressed upon them, thick and unbroken save for the faint rustle of wind through pine and the distant cry of unseen birds. The men ate then, not because hunger demanded it, but because the act grounded them. Bread was broken, dried meat torn, water passed from hand to hand. The taste seemed richer here, mingled with the scent of soil and leaf, no longer dulled by endless salt. They chewed slowly, their jaws working not only from need but from reverence, as though each bite confirmed the reality of earth beneath their feet. After, Ragnar moved toward the line of grass. His boots pressed through it, the blades brushing against his cloak, their dampness soaking fabric. Beyond lay the first trees, their trunks wide, their bark rough with age. He touched one, his palm flat against its surface, his fingers tracing grooves and knots. The wood was cold, solid, unyielding. He pressed harder, then stepped back, his eyes scanning upward to where branches wove into a canopy of shadow. The others followed, stepping cautiously beneath the trees. The forest swallowed them with stillness, its silence deeper than sea or sky. The ground was soft, covered in needles and moss, its dampness rising through boots. The air was thick with the smell of pine, of resin, of soil rich with rot and growth. Light filtered down in scattered shafts, catching upon spiders' webs, upon drops of dew that clung to leaves. They moved only a little way, their steps measured, their eyes sharp. Every crack of twig beneath foot seemed loud, every rustle of branch a warning. Yet nothing stirred but birds, flitting unseen above, their wings beating faintly, their calls echoing through the stillness. When they returned to the shore, the sea lay calm, the boats steady, the sky brightening with the slow rise of sun. They set fires then, small at first, built from driftwood and dried grass. Smoke curled upward, sharp and gray, carrying the scent of flame and resin. The fire's warmth pressed against chilled skin, its crackle breaking the heavy silence. The men sat around it, their shoulders slumped, their eyes watching the flames with quiet intensity. Clothes were spread upon stones to dry, cloaks shaken free of salt. The men's bodies relaxed slightly, their muscles unwinding, their breath easing. Yet beneath the stillness lay caution. Eyes turned often toward the forest, ears pricked at every sound beyond the crackle of fire and the hiss of sea. As the day passed, the men busied themselves with small tasks. Some gathered stones to build a rough ring around the fire. Others cut branches, stripping them for use as poles or stakes. Water skins were filled anew from streams that trickled through the sand, their taste fresh, cool, a sweetness unknown for many weeks. Fish were caught near the shallows, their bodies silver in the sunlight, their flesh roasted upon sticks until the skin cracked and the smell of oil and salt filled the air. The taste was rich, almost overwhelming after so long at sea. The men ate slowly, their faces calm, their eyes softened by the simple pleasure of warmth and food. The dogs gnawed upon bones, their tails thumping against the sand. Smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the first true sense of rest since departure. Evening fell softly. The sun sank behind the trees, their shadows stretching long across the sand. The sky burned pale gold, then faded into purple, then into deepening blue. The fire grew brighter, its glow steady against the encroaching dark. Around it the men settled, their cloaks drawn, their bodies pressed close for warmth. Their voices rose in low murmurs, not songs, not tales, but fragments of thought, enough to bind them together. Ragnar sat in silence, his eyes upon the forest. The flames lit his face, their glow flickering across his features, casting shadows that deepened the lines of his brow, the hollows of his cheeks. He did not speak, yet his stillness carried weight. His presence held the men steady, anchoring them as firmly as the boats drawn upon the shore. The night deepened, the stars emerging above, sharp against the black sky. Their light mingled with the glow of fire, with the faint shimmer of moon upon the sea. The forest loomed dark and vast, its silence heavy, its depths unknown. Yet the men did not fear it wholly. They felt instead the quiet awe of those who have stepped into something larger than themselves. Sleep came slowly, broken by watchfulness. Some lay upon cloaks near the fire, their breaths deep, their bodies slack. Others kept eyes open, their hands upon weapons, their ears tuned to every rustle, every distant cry of owl or fox. The dogs shifted restlessly, their noses lifted to scents drifting from the trees. Yet nothing stirred that threatened, and the night passed in stillness. With dawn came a new beginning. The fire was stirred back to life, its smoke rising pale against the morning sky. The men ate what remained of bread and fish, their movements steadier now, less burdened with weariness. Their eyes turned toward the forest, toward the land that stretched unseen beyond it. For the first time since their departure, the sea lay behind them, no longer endless, no longer their sole companion. Earth was beneath their feet, solid and rich, filled with scents and sounds that promised both rest and trial. The path had turned, and with it, their lives. And so, with measured breath and steady heart, Ragnar and his men prepared to step deeper into the land that awaited, its silence heavy, its promise vast, its story only beginning. The morning after their first fire upon the shore was pale and cool, the air damp with mist rising from the sea. The tide had fallen low, leaving stones glistening with weed and shells scattered across wet sand. The men moved quietly among the boats, checking ropes, securing hulls, ensuring that nothing had shifted in the night. The sea, though calm, was never to be trusted fully. When this work was done, their eyes turned toward the forest. The wall of trees loomed dark and still, their trunks rising thick, their crowns woven into a canopy that swallowed the sky. The grass at the border bent beneath the wind, heavy with dew, and beyond it, shadow lay thick. The forest seemed not only a place of wood and earth, but a presence, watching in silence, waiting. Ragnar was first to step forward. His boots pressed into the wet sand, then through the coarse grass, and at last onto the soil beneath the trees. It was soft beneath his weight, covered with pine needles and moss, damp and rich with the scent of earth. The silence within was different from the shore's quiet. It was heavier, deeper, filled with the hush of hidden lives. The others followed, their steps measured, their hands upon axe or spear. The dogs moved ahead, their noses low, their tails stiff, their ears pricked at every sound. Now and then they stopped, their bodies tense, then moved again, their paws pressing silently into the forest floor. Light filtered down in thin shafts, broken by branches and leaves. Dust and tiny insects drifted within those beams, catching faint glimmers. The air was cool and heavy, holding the scent of pine resin, of damp bark, of mushrooms hidden among roots. Each breath carried more weight here, as though the forest pressed inward upon the lungs. The men walked in silence, their ears tuned to the smallest stir, the rustle of a squirrel in the branches above, the faint crack of a twig beneath their own boots, the hollow call of a wood dove somewhere deep within the trees. The forest spoke constantly, but in tones so subtle that it demanded stillness to hear. Ragnar's eyes moved from trunk to trunk, from moss to fern, from shaft of light to shadow. He read the ground as he had once read the sea, noting where soil lay damp, where roots rose thick, where trails of deer pressed faint paths through undergrowth. Each mark was a sign, each broken branch a story of what had passed before. They came upon a stream, its water running clear over stones, its sound soft yet constant. The men bent low, filling hands and skins, drinking deeply of the cold sweetness. The taste cut sharp against their tongues, fresh beyond measure after so long upon salted sea. Drops clung to their beards, their breaths steadying as they drank. The stream ran deeper into the forest, and they followed it for a time, its course a guide through the maze of trees. Ferns grew thick along its banks, their fronds dripping with dew, brushing against legs as they passed. Fish darted within its shallows, quick flashes of silver vanishing beneath stones. Birds stirred above, unseen among branches, their calls echoing in layers, some sharp, some low, blending into a chorus that filled the silence without breaking it. Now and then a shadow passed swiftly overhead, the beat of wings strong, the cry harsh and wild. The men looked upward, their eyes catching only glimpses before the shapes vanished once more. Deeper still they walked, the trees closing tighter, the light dimming. The ground rose and fell in ridges, roots twisting across their path, stones jutting sharp through moss. In places the air grew cooler, the shadows denser, the silence pressing harder. The forest seemed ancient, each tree older than memory, its bark carved with the slow work of years beyond count. The dogs barked suddenly, low and sharp. Ahead, in a clearing where the light struck faintly, a deer lifted its head. Its body was slender, its coat brown and soft, its ears pricked, its eyes wide. For a moment it stood still, the men frozen as well, the world holding its breath. Then it bounded away, its hooves light, vanishing between trees with only the faint crack of brush to mark its flight. The men let out their breath, some smiling faintly, others silent still. The forest had shown its life, not hostile, but distant, untouchable. It was a reminder that they were strangers here, guests in a place that belonged first to its own creatures. They moved on until the sun climbed high, though its light touched little of the ground beneath the canopy. When they paused, they ate in quiet. Bread softened in the stream's water, dried meat chewed slowly, shared between them. The taste was plain, but steadied their strength. Ragnar sat apart, his back against a trunk, his eyes upon the shadows. His breath was slow, his body still, yet within him lay a deep awareness. Each sound and scent carried into him as though the forest itself were speaking. He felt the age of it, the patience, the indifference. The sea had been vast and restless. The forest was vast in stillness, its weight pressing inward rather than outward. When they rose again, they marked the ground, cutting notches into trunks, laying stones upon one another, breaking branches in ways that pointed toward shore. The forest was easy to enter, but not to leave, and they would not risk losing their path. The afternoon grew darker as clouds gathered above. Wind stirred the treetops, their branches swaying, their sound deep, like the groaning of timbers in a storm. Leaves fluttered down, their edges damp with rain before it came. The first drops struck lightly, then more fell, the forest filling with the steady patter of water upon leaf and earth. The men pulled cloaks tighter, their steps careful upon slick moss. The rain was cool, but not harsh. It softened the air, deepened the sense of soil and resin, pressed the sounds of the forest into a hushed rhythm. Water trickled from branches, ran along roots, gathered in small pools that mirrored the gray sky above. By evening the rain had lessened, the forest dripping with its memory. Mist rose from the ground, curling among trunks, clinging to low branches. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer, the silence deeper. The men turned back then, following their marks, their path leading once more toward the sound of sea. When at last they emerged from the trees, the sight of open sky and pale sand filled them with quiet relief. The boats lay where they had left them, the fire's ashes still faint upon the stones. The sea stretched calm and gray, the horizon distant, the air heavy with salt once more. They set fire anew, its flames pushing back the mist, its smoke rising sharp into the evening air. Fish were roasted again, their flesh rich, their warmth steady. The men sat close, their cloaks damp, their bodies weary, yet their hearts steadier than before. They had walked the forest, touched its silence, breathed its air. It was strange, vast, unknown, but it was real, solid, alive. Ragnar sat near the fire, his eyes upon the dark line of trees. His face was calm, his gaze steady, his breath even. He felt the land settling within him, its weight joining that of the sea already carried. The forest had spoken in silence, and he had listened. He knew they had only touched its edge, and that its depths held more than could be known in a single day. Yet the path was begun, and the land had received them without wrath. The flames burned steady, the waves whispered against the shore, the forest loomed in shadow. The men rested, their bodies slack, their breaths deep. And the night passed, slow and patient, the stars wheeling silently above. The keel of the first boat struck gently against the shallows, the sound dull and final after so many days of water alone. The waves hissed up the sand, foaming white around the hull, then withdrew, leaving the boat rocking lightly in their retreat. Oars lifted, dripping, then lay still across the gunwales. Silence fell, deeper even than on the open sea. For a moment the men did not move. They sat upon their benches, their eyes fixed on the shore that stretched before them. Sand lay pale and damp, scattered with stones polished smooth by tide. Beyond it rose a line of grass, thick and coarse, its blades stirring faintly in the morning wind. Behind the grass loomed trees, dark and tall, their trunks rising close together, their crowns knitting into a wall of green shadow. The air was heavy with scents long absent, the sharpness of pine, the damp richness of earth, the faint sweetness of moss. After weeks of salt and water, the smell struck them with force, filling lungs, pressing deep into thought. Some of the men drew in long breaths, closing their eyes as if to drink it fully. Others clenched fists upon their knees, holding themselves still, unwilling to show the trembling that stirred within them. Ragnar stood first. His boots stepped from wood to sand, sinking slightly into the damp ground. He paused there, his eyes upon the trees, his shoulders straight, his presence calm. The sea whispered at his back, but he did not turn. The land stretched before him, silent, waiting. One by one, the others followed. Their boots pressed into sand, their cloaks stirred by wind, their eyes shifting from forest to shore to sky. Some bent low, touching the earth with calloused hands, rubbing grains of sand between fingers as though to prove it real. Others lifted stones, weighing them, turning them, their surfaces rough and solid after weeks of nothing but water's fluid shape. The dogs leapt ashore too, their paws scattering sand, their noses pressed to earth, their tails high. They ran in short bursts, then stopped, sniffing, their ears pricked, their bodies tense with the strangeness of scent. Their presence stirred something steady in the men, a reminder of hearths and fires left behind. The boats were pulled higher, their hulls scraping against shingle. Ropes were secured to stones, anchors set deep, sails folded. The men moved slowly, their bodies weary, yet their hands precise, careful not to leave their vessels vulnerable. For though land promised rest, it also carried the unknown, and the boats remained their only tie to safety. When the work was done, they gathered upon the sand. Their breaths rose in faint clouds, their faces pale with weariness, their eyes dark with wonder. None spoke loudly. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. Instead, they looked outward, to the trees, to the grass, to the hills that rose faintly beyond. The silence of the land pressed upon them, thick and unbroken save for the faint rustle of wind through pine and the distant cry of unseen birds. The men ate then, not because hunger demanded it, but because the act grounded them. Bread was broken, dried meat torn, water passed from hand to hand. The taste seemed richer here, mingled with the scent of soil and leaf, no longer dulled by endless salt. They chewed slowly, their jaws working not only from need but from reverence, as though each bite confirmed the reality of earth beneath their feet. After, Ragnar moved toward the line of grass. His boots pressed through it, the blades brushing against his cloak, their dampness soaking fabric. Beyond lay the first trees, their trunks wide, their bark rough with age. He touched one, his palm flat against its surface, his fingers tracing grooves and knots. The wood was cold, solid, unyielding. He pressed harder, then stepped back, his eyes scanning upward to where branches wove into a canopy of shadow. The others followed, stepping cautiously beneath the trees. The forest swallowed them with stillness, its silence deeper than sea or sky. The ground was soft, covered in needles and moss, its dampness rising through boots. The air was thick with the smell of pine, of resin, of soil rich with rot and growth. Light filtered down in scattered shafts, catching upon spiders' webs, upon drops of dew that clung to leaves. They moved only a little way, their steps measured, their eyes sharp. Every crack of twig beneath foot seemed loud, every rustle of branch a warning. Yet nothing stirred but birds, flitting unseen above, their wings beating faintly, their calls echoing through the stillness. When they returned to the shore, the sea lay calm, the boats steady, the sky brightening with the slow rise of sun. They set fires then, small at first, built from driftwood and dried grass. Smoke curled upward, sharp and gray, carrying the scent of flame and resin. The fire's warmth pressed against chilled skin, its crackle breaking the heavy silence. The men sat around it, their shoulders slumped, their eyes watching the flames with quiet intensity. Clothes were spread upon stones to dry, cloaks shaken free of salt. The men's bodies relaxed slightly, their muscles unwinding, their breath easing. Yet beneath the stillness lay caution. Eyes turned often toward the forest, ears pricked at every sound beyond the crackle of fire and the hiss of sea. As the day passed, the men busied themselves with small tasks. Some gathered stones to build a rough ring around the fire. Others cut branches, stripping them for use as poles or stakes. Water skins were filled anew from streams that trickled through the sand, their taste fresh, cool, a sweetness unknown for many weeks. Fish were caught near the shallows, their bodies silver in the sunlight, their flesh roasted upon sticks until the skin cracked and the smell of oil and salt filled the air. The taste was rich, almost overwhelming after so long at sea. The men ate slowly, their faces calm, their eyes softened by the simple pleasure of warmth and food. The dogs gnawed upon bones, their tails thumping against the sand. Smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the first true sense of rest since departure. Evening fell softly. The sun sank behind the trees, their shadows stretching long across the sand. The sky burned pale gold, then faded into purple, then into deepening blue. The fire grew brighter, its glow steady against the encroaching dark. Around it the men settled, their cloaks drawn, their bodies pressed close for warmth. Their voices rose in low murmurs, not songs, not tales, but fragments of thought, enough to bind them together. Ragnar sat in silence, his eyes upon the forest. The flames lit his face, their glow flickering across his features, casting shadows that deepened the lines of his brow, the hollows of his cheeks. He did not speak, yet his stillness carried weight. His presence held the men steady, anchoring them as firmly as the boats drawn upon the shore. The night deepened, the stars emerging above, sharp against the black sky. Their light mingled with the glow of fire, with the faint shimmer of moon upon the sea. The forest loomed dark and vast, its silence heavy, its depths unknown. Yet the men did not fear it wholly. They felt instead the quiet awe of those who have stepped into something larger than themselves. Sleep came slowly, broken by watchfulness. Some lay upon cloaks near the fire, their breaths deep, their bodies slack. Others kept eyes open, their hands upon weapons, their ears tuned to every rustle, every distant cry of owl or fox. The dogs shifted restlessly, their noses lifted to scents drifting from the trees. Yet nothing stirred that threatened, and the night passed in stillness. With dawn came a new beginning. The fire was stirred back to life, its smoke rising pale against the morning sky. The men ate what remained of bread and fish, their movements steadier now, less burdened with weariness. Their eyes turned toward the forest, toward the land that stretched unseen beyond it. For the first time since their departure, the sea lay behind them, no longer endless, no longer their sole companion. Earth was beneath their feet, solid and rich, filled with scents and sounds that promised both rest and trial. The path had turned, and with it, their lives. And so, with measured breath and steady heart, Ragnar and his men prepared to step deeper into the land that awaited, its silence heavy, its promise vast, its story only beginning. The morning after their first fire upon the shore was pale and cool, the air damp with mist rising from the sea. The tide had fallen low, leaving stones glistening with weed and shells scattered across wet sand. The men moved quietly among the boats, checking ropes, securing hulls, ensuring that nothing had shifted in the night. The sea, though calm, was never to be trusted fully. When this work was done, their eyes turned toward the forest. The wall of trees loomed dark and still, their trunks rising thick, their crowns woven into a canopy that swallowed the sky. The grass at the border bent beneath the wind, heavy with dew, and beyond it, shadow lay thick. The forest seemed not only a place of wood and earth, but a presence, watching in silence, waiting. Ragnar was first to step forward. His boots pressed into the wet sand, then through the coarse grass, and at last onto the soil beneath the trees. It was soft beneath his weight, covered with pine needles and moss, damp and rich with the scent of earth. The silence within was different from the shore's quiet. It was heavier, deeper, filled with the hush of hidden lives. The others followed, their steps measured, their hands upon axe or spear. The dogs moved ahead, their noses low, their tails stiff, their ears pricked at every sound. Now and then they stopped, their bodies tense, then moved again, their paws pressing silently into the forest floor. Light filtered down in thin shafts, broken by branches and leaves. Dust and tiny insects drifted within those beams, catching faint glimmers. The air was cool and heavy, holding the scent of pine resin, of damp bark, of mushrooms hidden among roots. Each breath carried more weight here, as though the forest pressed inward upon the lungs. The men walked in silence, their ears tuned to the smallest stir, the rustle of a squirrel in the branches above, the faint crack of a twig beneath their own boots, the hollow call of a wood dove somewhere deep within the trees. The forest spoke constantly, but in tones so subtle that it demanded stillness to hear. Ragnar's eyes moved from trunk to trunk, from moss to fern, from shaft of light to shadow. He read the ground as he had once read the sea, noting where soil lay damp, where roots rose thick, where trails of deer pressed faint paths through undergrowth. Each mark was a sign, each broken branch a story of what had passed before. They came upon a stream, its water running clear over stones, its sound soft yet constant. The men bent low, filling hands and skins, drinking deeply of the cold sweetness. The taste cut sharp against their tongues, fresh beyond measure after so long upon salted sea. Drops clung to their beards, their breaths steadying as they drank. The stream ran deeper into the forest, and they followed it for a time, its course a guide through the maze of trees. Ferns grew thick along its banks, their fronds dripping with dew, brushing against legs as they passed. Fish darted within its shallows, quick flashes of silver vanishing beneath stones. Birds stirred above, unseen among branches, their calls echoing in layers, some sharp, some low, blending into a chorus that filled the silence without breaking it. Now and then a shadow passed swiftly overhead, the beat of wings strong, the cry harsh and wild. The men looked upward, their eyes catching only glimpses before the shapes vanished once more. Deeper still they walked, the trees closing tighter, the light dimming. The ground rose and fell in ridges, roots twisting across their path, stones jutting sharp through moss. In places the air grew cooler, the shadows denser, the silence pressing harder. The forest seemed ancient, each tree older than memory, its bark carved with the slow work of years beyond count. The dogs barked suddenly, low and sharp. Ahead, in a clearing where the light struck faintly, a deer lifted its head. Its body was slender, its coat brown and soft, its ears pricked, its eyes wide. For a moment it stood still, the men frozen as well, the world holding its breath. Then it bounded away, its hooves light, vanishing between trees with only the faint crack of brush to mark its flight. The men let out their breath, some smiling faintly, others silent still. The forest had shown its life, not hostile, but distant, untouchable. It was a reminder that they were strangers here, guests in a place that belonged first to its own creatures. They moved on until the sun climbed high, though its light touched little of the ground beneath the canopy. When they paused, they ate in quiet. Bread softened in the stream's water, dried meat chewed slowly, shared between them. The taste was plain, but steadied their strength. Ragnar sat apart, his back against a trunk, his eyes upon the shadows. His breath was slow, his body still, yet within him lay a deep awareness. Each sound and scent carried into him as though the forest itself were speaking. He felt the age of it, the patience, the indifference. The sea had been vast and restless. The forest was vast in stillness, its weight pressing inward rather than outward. When they rose again, they marked the ground, cutting notches into trunks, laying stones upon one another, breaking branches in ways that pointed toward shore. The forest was easy to enter, but not to leave, and they would not risk losing their path. The afternoon grew darker as clouds gathered above. Wind stirred the treetops, their branches swaying, their sound deep, like the groaning of timbers in a storm. Leaves fluttered down, their edges damp with rain before it came. The first drops struck lightly, then more fell, the forest filling with the steady patter of water upon leaf and earth. The men pulled cloaks tighter, their steps careful upon slick moss. The rain was cool, but not harsh. It softened the air, deepened the sense of soil and resin. pressed the sounds of the forest into a hushed rhythm. Water trickled from branches, ran along roots, gathered in small pools that mirrored the gray sky above. By evening the rain had lessened, the forest dripping with its memory. Mist rose from the ground, curling among trunks, clinging to low branches. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer, the silence deeper. The men turned back then, following their marks, their path leading once more toward the sound of sea. When at last they emerged from the trees, the sight of open sky and pale sand filled them with quiet relief. The boats lay where they had left them, the fire's ashes still faint upon the stones. The sea stretched calm and gray, the horizon distant, the air heavy with salt once more. They set fire anew, its flames pushing back the mist, its smoke rising sharp into the evening air. Fish were roasted again, their flesh rich, their warmth steady. The men sat close, their cloaks damp, their bodies weary, yet their hearts steadier than before. They had walked the forest, touched its silence, breathed its air. It was strange, vast, unknown, but it was real, solid, alive. Ragnar sat near the fire, his eyes upon the dark line of trees. His face was calm, his gaze steady, his breath even. He felt the land settling within him, its weight joining that of the sea already carried. The forest had spoken in silence, and he had listened. He knew they had only touched its edge, and that its depths held more than could be known in a single day. Yet the path was begun, and the land had received them without wrath. The flames burned steady, the waves whispered against the shore, the forest loomed in shadow. The men rested, their bodies slack, their breaths deep. And the night passed, slow and patient, the stars wheeling silently above. They rose before the sun, as they had done often since leaving the shingle. Yet this day felt charged differently, as if the forest itself had held its breath and now exhaled some secret upon the air. The mist lay heavy in the low places, clinging to the trunks like veils. The ground underfoot was a dark tapestry of last night's rain and the slow decomposition of leaves. Men tightened cloaks about themselves and moved with careful tread, memory of the shore behind, and a desire to learn more of what lay within before them pressing the pace. Ragnar led, not with fanfare, but with a steady certainty that shaped the path of those who followed. He carried no map, only the faint braille of his experience, a notch in a trunk, a stone set upright, a trail of broken undergrowth where feet had trod before. His hand brushed bark and lichen as he passed, the touch a way to gauge age and to read history and growth. The dogs had moved ahead, tongues lolling, noses to earth, and then had checked back at intervals as though to confirm all were together. They entered the valley where the trees arched like a vaulted hall. Light there was scarce, falling in the long, slow beams of morning that caught upon motes of dust and spore, making them seem to float like small, slow stars. The pace slackened into silence. Speech felt too loud for such a place. Each footstep was swallowed by needles and moss. Each inhalation brought the forest's dense perfume, damp earth, resinous pine, the faint metallic tang of old iron long turned to soil. At first, their find was small and easy to dismiss. A flattened patch of earth circled by stones, blackened soil dried and still stained with the ghost of heat. The men crouched close, hands unloved to feel the texture of ash mingled with charcoal. It smelled faintly of smoke even there, old, cool, almost sweet in its decay. Beside the ring lay fragments of something woven and browned, fibers stiff as bone. No bright seams or painted glaze marked them. These were the plain remnants of cloth or matting, its twine eaten thin by time. Fingers brushed them with a tenderness reserved for relics, as though rough hands could somehow resurrect the soft-side lives that had once bent over such objects. The ring of stones was not alone. A line of post holes cut shallow into the earth traced the outline of a small structure, no larger than a storeroom, perhaps, or a place to shelter tools and food. The trunks of the posts were long gone, yet their ghosts remained as darker circles in the soil. Around these, small iron nails protruded with the stubborn dignity of treasure, their heads green with verdigris. When one of the men pried gently, the nail came free with a dull reluctance and left a scent of old metal that rose like a faint memory in the cool air. Further inward, The forest surrendered other signs as if it were a careful keeper, showing one thread at a time. A stone flattened and set upright bore scratches along its surface, lines arranged with intention rather than the random cry of roots. The grooves had filled with moss and lichen, but the pattern could still be read, circles within circles, and a straight band etched across the face like a path. No painter's pigment remained to color these marks. Instead, the moss itself accented the carvings, making the patterns appear as if they were meant to be revealed slowly to those who waited long enough to look. Near this stone was a scatter of small bones, bleached white despite the damp. They lay like the remnants of a meal left in hurry and abandonment. Fragments of rib, the curved section of a jaw, a bird's delicate humerus blackened at one edge. Each told a quiet tale of flesh taken from land and hearth, of hands that had stretched toward firelight. The men gathered these fragments with a reverent slowness, turning them in their palms as if each could reveal who had held them before. The bones carried a scent, not of rot, but of something older, a sweetness of marrow and sea and sun that clung to memories of other meals eaten around other fires. Beyond the ring and the carved stone, the ground rose a little into a slope where the remains of structures lay half swallowed by moss and root. Stone foundations, low and roughly hewn, suggested once square spaces, perhaps dwellings or communal enclosures, now collapsed into the patience of earth. Their corners still held tighter stones, blackened along one side, as if a long-ago flame had licked at their edges. Between them grew hedges of bracken that brushed the men's thighs and whispered when they passed. Here and there, wooden fragments lay in pale disarray. A carved corner, its pattern of braided lines familiar to the men though altered by time, suggested a post or lintel from a doorway. The wood's grain showed the hand of better workmanship than simple subsistence. A small disc of hammered metal, green with corrosion, bore a pierced center and hinted at decoration once pinned to cloth or leather. These artifacts were enough to tell the common things. Life had been here, with some attention to making, to beauty even within need. The hush of the place was broken by the slow staccato of rain from high leaves, each drop a tiny bell. Water pooled in hollows, and the men's footsteps left temporary prints before they were smoothed by a slow gathering of silt and leaf. Near one foundation lay a shallow pit, black at the bottom. Inside it, careful and deliberate, someone had placed a ring of pebbles, their surfaces cracked smooth by weather. At the center lay a stone, darker than the rest, worn down not by time alone, but by hands. Around it, faint marks in the soil suggested offerings left in cycles. A feather, a twisted root, a smear of red that could have been clay or rust. As the men moved among these relics, their voices came less as sentences than as breath. Each small find was examined with a gentleness that mingled curiosity and respect. They had known the sea intimately, the straightforward honesty of wave and wind. But this was a different realm of knowing, a history stitched into soil and growth. The absence itself spoke as loudly as the objects. No scattered tools indicating sudden flight, no scale of trade goods to mark the ruin as merely a deserted farm. Instead, there was something measured in how the bones had been left, how the stones had been set, as though the place had been closed with ceremony, with the cautious kindness of those who make a space theirs and then choose to depart. Ragnar lingered at a low cairn that seemed less natural than formed. The stones there were arranged in a modest dome, each placed with intention. On top, a broken spindle of bone lay partly buried. The pattern told of a life touched by craft, threads long since cut, a person who sat in quiet and wound fiber over wood until a spindle shivered with thin thread. Around the cairn, small shells lay scattered like punctuation marks, pale and slightly iridescent when the light found them through the canopy. Their presence mingled with the scent of pine and the faint tang of sea carried from the shore, a mingling of two worlds, land and water, sewn together in the memory of this place. There were signs also of younger disturbance, a footprint that bore the sharper edge of a modern soul, a notch in a tree where someone's axe had bitten recent wood. Yet the older traces were dominant. They had the weight of time, their edges softened by years and growth. This made the men speak softly, even when asking one another of what they had found, as if loudness might disturb the careful balance the forest held in guarding its stories. The pattern of the remains suggested not a single family dwelling but a small gathering, perhaps a seasonal hamlet, or a place of meeting used occasionally by those who followed both land and sea. An open space at the center showed signs of repeated use, its soil packed hard, its stones set in a rough circle that suggested assembly rather than habitation. The stone's carved spiral might have marked a boundary or a direction, a way of turning the world into meaning. The men understood that the people who had lived here had shaped their world with symbols and practicalities alike. When they found the ruined post with the carved face, a gasp moved through some of the younger men, though it was barely more than the rustle of breath. The post was half decayed, its carved features softened by rot and the slow skinning of bark. Yet a face remained, eyes hollowed and deep, a mouth set in an ambiguous line. Around its forehead, faint incisions suggested a crown or binding of rope. It had been a figure of watching, perhaps, set at an entrance or chosen as sentinel beneath the trees. To stand before it felt like encountering an old guardian whose watch had passed beyond the witness of living men. They moved on, tentatively finding more fragments that knit together a sense of a life both ordinary and near to ritual. A shallow bowl of baked clay lay half-buried, its rim nicked, but the inside still bearing the dark patina of many uses. Grains crushed, stews thickened, perhaps herbs steeped and shared. The bowl's glaze was faint, a washed blue that had long since leached into the soil but left ghosts of color in tiny cracks. Near it, a strip of copper threaded through a loop of leather hinted at trade. Metals not local, perhaps brought in via river and sea, exchanged for furs, for salt, for stories. The deeper they went, the thicker the sense of presence became. Not a ghostly haunting of the kind sung in later tales, but a bodily sense of human life sedimented into place. The slow wear of tread paths, the hollows of seats formed in earth, the tiny stones used as scrapers near where someone had tended hides. The men found a cluster of holes, rounded and dark, their edges charred as though once used as ovens. A charred bone lay across one, blackened entirely and fragile to touch. When lifted it crumbled like bread, leaving only the faintest scent of old flesh and fat. No sudden violence showed. Rather, the traces evinced a careful economy of life, the gathering of wood and seed, the making of use in small, necessary ways. There was mystery too. Beneath a slab of stone, partly concealed by pressed earth, lay a flat piece of worked horn, its surface incised with a tiny map perhaps, or a counting of seasons, lines and dots regular and purposeful. The pattern did not correspond to any eye-catching symbol, but held an almost bureaucratic calm, markers of time, of herd, of harvest. To Ragnar it felt like the handwriting of a people who had kept careful watch over their days, noting the slow shifts of moon and tide as one notes the rise of bread. Once, as light slanted through branches and the air took on the hush of afternoon, they discovered a small clearing where the shadows pooled like ink. In its center sat a stone arranged with care, larger than the rest, and upon its face another carving, worn but clear, the image of a boat curved up from the sea, its prow carved in stylized curl. Around it, the ground bore fingerprints, small imprints of hands pressed into clay, perhaps by children playing near the edges of their day, or by adults making offerings. The sight of the boat carving tightened something in the chest of more than one of the men. It was a reminder that those who had once lived here had known the sea as intimately as they did. The carving tied the place to journeys and to the water that lay beyond the trees, a bridge between two modes of being. The men paused long at the edge of an area where the undergrowth grew scant and the forest seemed to open into a larger, more deliberate space. Here the stones were smoother, worn by hands and feet, as if a path had once been trod often. The soil showed the shadows of habit, compacted tracks that moved deliberately toward a thin outcropping of rock. Upon that rock lay, half buried, what could have been the base of a post or a marker, its surface smoothed by weather and the passing of years. There was a faintness there, an odor that could not be named, some dried resin perhaps, or the residue of offerings made to keep a place safe. As dusk fell, the forest took on the hushed reverence of a chapel. The men gathered their finds, small and meaningful things, and wrapped them in cloth for the journey back. Each object was treated as testimony, a shard of pottery, a spindle whorl, a carved bone. Even the smallest fragment was held as evidence that life had once brewed here with a slow heat that now only warmed the soil beneath walking feet. They did not stay to excavate or to linger long. To dig, they knew, would require time and tools and the steady work of those who could tend earth across seasons. To take away more would be to risk angering some careful balance the forest held. So they left most things where they lay, covering them lightly with a scatter of leaves as if to close lids until someone might return with gentler curiosity. On the walk back, the men were quieter than they had been on the way in. The finds had altered the tenor of their presence, bending it toward thought rather than mere conquest. The world that had received them now felt layered, their own footprints superimposed upon those that belonged to other hands, their fires to be kindled again where others had already kept them. There was a sense not of claim but of permission, an uneasy but respectful sharing of space between living and memory. Night found them at the shore. They set the fires slow, with careful feeding so as not to smoke too thickly into the trees. The men sat in a ring, the objects between them like tokens from another life. Fingers traced carvings, palm met bone, eyes read the faded lines. Their talk was low, more thoughtful than in previous evenings. Questions rose that had no immediate answers. Who had lived here and left in what manner? Had they moved toward river or sea, to trading routes or to marriage? Had they been driven away, or had they left by choice, carrying their gods and craft to some other shore? Ragnar looked upon these things with the cool patience of one who knows the sea's habit of taking and giving warning. He did not force conclusions, nor did he indulge in fable. He held within him rather the sense that their arrival upon this land had been anticipated long ago by hands now gone. The carved boat upon the stone had told them that their own journeys were not without precedent, that men who trusted both tide and forest had come before, setting marks that outlived their names. When the fire burned low and the men were ready for sleep, they erected a small cairn of their own, not as a claim but as an answer. A single stone placed upon a flat boulder near the carved boat. It was a small touch, unassuming, meant to mark that living men had passed through, honoring those who had left their marks earlier. Each man pressed the stone in place with his own hand, letting the action be a quiet promise, to tread lightly, to remember, to return perhaps one day with offerings of bread and song. Sleep that night was deeper than before. The men lay with the murmur of waves at their backs and the heavy presence of trees before them. Dreams came not of raiding or plunder, but of gatherings, of people sharing bread at rounded stones, children running between trunks, old hands carving spiral marks into soft wood. In the morning, the forest would still be there, patient, its stories hidden in root and stone. For now, they would carry the memory of what they had found like a fragile compass, guiding how they would move through the days to come. At dawn, as they prepared to break camp and again step inland, Ragnar paused once more at the carved stone. His hand, calloused and steady, traced the shallow groove of the boat's prow. He felt the coolness of lichen under his fingers and a soft, sure knowledge settled in him, that this place knew of those who crossed water and of those who listened, and that both were part of the world's slow story. He turned then, and with quiet strength led his men forward, the forest's hush folding gently behind them as they walked back toward the shore and on to whatever would come next. The morning came pale and unhurried, as though the sky itself sought to delay the day's wait. A slow light spread across the shore, first a gray wash upon the sea, then a faint gold upon the sand where dew clung like tiny jewels. The forest loomed unchanged, dark and solemn, yet within the men something had shifted. They had seen remnants of another life, another people who had once stood beneath those same trees. It was no longer an untouched wilderness. It was a land with memory. Ragnar rose before the others, as he often did, his boots crunching softly over the damp stones. He walked to the edge of the tide, watching as the waves drew in and retreated, their rhythm endless, their sound like the slow breathing of the earth itself. His gaze lifted to the line of the forest. He did not speak aloud, yet within him the silent awareness lingered, that choices must be made not only with strength, but with respect for what lay hidden beneath roots and soil. When the men gathered, they did so with a quieter air than usual. Bread was passed, hard crusts softened in water, chewed in steady rhythm. Fish smoked over the embers of last night's fire, their skin crisp, their flesh yielding warmth to weary stomachs. There was little laughter, little rough talk. Their minds, too, turned toward the carvings, the cairn, the carved boat that seemed to echo their own lives back to them. It was agreed without argument that the day's work should not be a deep venture into the forest, but rather a tracing along its edge and the coastline, a patient exploration to see if the remnants of human hands stretched beyond that one ruin. So they set out in a long line, their steps slow, their eyes sharp, the dogs ranging before them with eager snouts. The coast curved gently, the sand broken by outcroppings of rock, where seaweed clung and gulls perched with sharp cries. The air smelled of brine and wet stone, mingled faintly with pine carried down by the morning wind. As they walked, they noticed signs subtle but clear, faint depressions where feet had once pressed, stones arranged not by chance but by hand, the faint remnants of a trail running parallel to the shore. It was not fresh. Moss and grass had crept back across it, and roots had broken through, yet the shape remained. A path once walked many times, now surrendered to silence. Ragnar crouched, pressing his palm flat against the earth, reading its firmness. He could almost sense the feet that had passed there, bare soles, leather sandals, carrying burdens of fish or wood, speaking words that no longer echoed. They followed this faint way for a time. It led them to a narrow stream cutting down toward the sea, its banks trodden in a way that told of long use. The water was clear, cool to the touch, its bed scattered with smooth stones. One of the men lifted a pebble shaped by hand, pierced with a hole. A weight, perhaps, for net or loom. Another sign that lives had gathered here, using the sea as sustenance, as kin. As the sun climbed, their eyes found more. A circle of stones upon a rise above the shore, overgrown with grass, yet unmistakably deliberate. In its center lay nothing but earth and weeds, but the pattern itself told of gathering, perhaps feasting or speaking, perhaps the sharing of law or story. The men stood in silence around it, feeling the weight of centuries in its simplicity. Ragnar let his gaze wander from the circle to the sea beyond. He thought of his own people, how they too gathered in circles to speak of law, to weigh the worth of a man's deeds. The likeness was not lost on him. In this land far from home, another people had shaped their lives in rhythms not unlike his own. By midday they reached a headland where cliffs rose sheer above the waves. Here the wind blew stronger, carrying the cry of gulls and the deep roar of surf against stone. The men stood looking outward, their hair and cloaks whipped by gusts, the salt stinging their lips. Far below, foam gathered in hollows, surging and retreating in endless motion. The cliffs were streaked with nests, birds wheeling in restless arcs. It was here, among the rocks at the cliff's edge, that they found another mark of human hand, a line of stones set upright, forming a low wall against the wind. Within its shelter, the ground was flat and blackened, perhaps once used as a place to keep watch, to light a beacon, to call ships to shore. Ashes still lay within the soil, faint though they were, as though a fire had been tended long, long ago. The men stood within that circle of stones, the sea roaring below, the sky wide above, and felt themselves joined to those who had once stood here. They too had watched the horizon, searching for sails, for the return of kin, for the approach of strangers. They too had known the endless uncertainty of sea, the endless patience of waiting. Ragnar's hand rested upon one of the stones, rough with age, lichen clinging in pale patches. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. The wind carried no words, yet it seemed heavy with memory. He opened them again, his gaze steady. This was no place to claim in haste. It was a place to learn, to move within gently, to let the land speak in its own time. By evening they returned to their camp, weary yet thoughtful. Their finds were modest, stones, paths, the faint traces of human lives, but they carried the weight of connection. They sat once more around the fire, its glow casting long shadows, its warmth easing chilled limbs. The objects they had gathered were laid upon a cloth, simple offerings from the day's search. They did not speak much, yet their silence was not empty. It was filled with the slow working of thought, with the recognition that this land was not empty, not new, but part of a longer story into which they had stepped. Ragnar looked upon the fire, upon his men, upon the objects they had found, and felt a calm resolve settle within him. The path ahead would not be one of conquest alone, nor of reckless hunger. It would be a path of listening, of seeking, of shaping their place within a land that already bore the marks of others. Strength would still be needed, but patience also, and a respect for what lay hidden in shadow and soil. The fire burned low, the waves whispered beyond the dark, the forest loomed as silent witness. One by one the men lay down, their breath slow, their dreams touched not by fear, but by the soft weight of history pressing gently upon them. The land was speaking, and for now, they were listening. The dawn came subdued, as though the sky itself wished to veil the world in calm. A pale mist hung low upon the sea, softening the line between water and air until both seemed one vast, breathing veil. The sand was cool, the tide quiet, the gulls not yet restless. The men stirred slowly, their movements gentle, as though the silence of the morning pressed upon their shoulders. Ragnar rose, as always, before most. His boots sank lightly into the damp sand as he walked toward the water's edge. He watched the horizon with steady eyes, noting the faint glimmer where sun touched the veil of mist. There was no urgency in him, no restless hunger. The days past had settled him into a rhythm not unlike the sea's own breathing, patient, recurring, without haste. When the men gathered, their meal was simple: smoked fish, hard bread softened in seawater, a little dried fruit from their stores. They ate in measured silence, not from weariness but from the deepening quiet that had taken hold since their discoveries. The ruins, the carved stones, the faint paths, all had left their mark upon them. They had become listeners, patient to the land's muted voice. That day, it was decided without words that they would turn their steps farther along the coast, letting the forest remain a dark and solemn backdrop. The sea, with its open light, seemed to offer a gentler path. So they walked, their boots crunching softly upon sand and pebble, the dogs trotting ahead, the mist curling and thinning as the sun slowly climbed. The shoreline stretched in long sweeps, broken at times by low cliffs where waves lapped and echoed. Seaweed lay in dark tangles, glistening with beads of dew. Shells cracked beneath their heels, gulls rose with lazy wings, and the air tasted of salt and faint resin carried from the woods. For hours they moved in this manner, unhurried, their eyes drifting across both sea and land. It was one of the younger men who first paused, raising a hand toward a faint smear above the trees inland. At first it seemed only another piece of mist, yet as they watched it grew more certain, rising in a thin, pale column. Smoke. They did not speak. They stood, their breathing slowed, their gazes steady. Smoke did not rise by chance. It was the breath of fire tended by human hands. Ragnar's eyes lingered upon it, his face calm. He did not gesture for haste, nor did he turn away. Instead, he simply nodded once, and the men moved again, their pace steady, neither rushing toward nor fleeing from what they had seen. The shoreline curved, and with it the smoke shifted, sometimes hidden by trees, sometimes clear above them. They followed, always at a measured distance. The day stretched on, the sun rising and falling in its arc, the sea darkening with the slow deepening of afternoon. The smoke did not fade. Closer to evening they found other signs. A net stretched across driftwood poles, half hidden among reeds, its cords still damp from the tide. Stones arranged in a rough circle upon the beach, blackened with recent fire. The faint print of a foot in wet sand, narrower than their own, its edges still sharp before the tide could claim it. The men stood long in silence over these marks. Each knew what they meant. Not ruins, not memory alone, but presence. A people still moved here, still tended their nets, still lit their fires, still left their footprints in the soft earth. They did not seek them. Not then. Instead, Ragnar lifted his gaze inland once more, watching the smoke as it thinned against the pale sky of evening. He seemed neither eager nor afraid. He simply let the sight rest upon him, as one accepts the turning of tide or season. The men returned to their camp by the shore, their steps slow, their minds full. They spoke little as they lit their own fire, as they laid fish upon it, as they gathered close against the cooling air. The sea whispered, the flames flickered, the dogs curled beside them. The thought of others nearby lingered like a faint pulse beneath all they did. Ragnar sat in silence long after the others had settled, the fire's glow upon his face, the sea dark before him. He thought of all that had passed, the first sight of this coast. The forest with its hush of secrecy, the stones carved by vanished hands, the faint paths, the circle, the cairn. Each had drawn them deeper into the land's memory. And now, the smoke, the footprints, the nets, the present rising gently from the veil of history. The night passed calm. Stars wheeled overhead, their cold fires steady, the air sharp and still. Dreams came slow, touched not by battle or storm, but by the rhythm of waves and the shadow of trees. The men breathed as one, their bodies resting, their minds drifting in the wide hush of the land. Morning came once more, soft and pale, the mist drawn thin across the sea. The fire's embers glowed faint red before being coaxed into flame again. Bread was broken, fish warmed, water drawn fresh from the stream. The men stirred themselves with the quiet patience of those who knew that no great haste was required. Again their eyes turned inland, to where smoke had risen. It was fainter now, perhaps further, perhaps the day's air carrying it away. The knowledge remained nonetheless. They were not alone. The land they had entered still held lives of its own. Ragnar rose and walked to the tide's edge. The waves touched his boots, the salt cool upon leather, the pull of water steady. He looked long across the sea, then back toward the dark line of the forest. His breath moved slow, his shoulders easy. No words left him, yet within his stillness there was acceptance. The story was not only his, not only theirs. It was part of something broader, unfolding beyond them. When he returned to the camp, the men were readying their packs. There was no need for command, no need for instruction. They moved with the same unspoken accord that had carried them this far. Together, they turned once more to the shoreline, their steps slow, their breaths calm, their eyes steady. The sea sang softly beside them, endless, patient, unchanging. The forest held its secrets in quiet shadow. And far off, unseen but known, others tended their fire, drew their nets, walked their own paths upon the soil. The day moved onward, the light shifting, the air warming, the gulls rising and falling in their ceaseless arcs. The men walked, their shadows stretching, their thoughts unvoiced. Ragnar's gaze lingered always upon the horizon, as though he saw both sea and sky, past and future, bound in a single, quiet thread. No meeting came that day, nor the next. Only signs, faint yet sure, a woven basket left upon a stone, a path cut through reeds, the scent of smoke carried upon evening air. Always near, never reached. A presence felt, not confronted. So the days settled into rhythm. The sea, the fire, the faint marks of others, the silence of their own thoughts. And slowly, the urgency of discovery gave way to calm. It was enough to know, enough to sense the lives beyond sight, enough to walk the coast with patient breath, with eyes open to stone, to tree, to water, to sky. As the season edged onward, the men grew accustomed to this balance. Their own fire beside the sea, and another somewhere inland. Their own nets, and others' footprints in the sand. Not confrontation, not conquest, but a quiet coexistence within the wide, breathing world. Ragnar often sat apart, his figure outlined against the sea's slow light, his face unreadable yet serene. Within him lay the weight of memory, his journeys past, his battles, his triumphs and losses, and also the stillness of this place, where history and presence intertwined. In time, the details blurred, one evening's fire blending into the next, one tide into another, footprints washed away, smoke rising and fading. What remained was the rhythm itself, the steady breathing of land and sea, the quiet persistence of life in all its forms. And so the story came to rest, not with clash, not with sharp ending, but with a slow fading into silence. The men walked, the sea breathed, the forest held its shadow. Ragnar stood between them, patient, unhurried, listening. The smoke still rose, somewhere beyond the trees. The waves still curled upon the shore. And time itself moved onward, unbroken, unhurried, eternal.